It was 3 o'clock in the morning. An outdoor warning siren suddenly began screaming across part of Huntington County, Indiana. There was no tornado, no severe thunderstorm, no hazardous material release, no local emergency at all. And nobody in the Huntington County ECC Center had activated it. Apparently, the command that triggered the siren came from somewhere roughly 300 miles away in Iowa. It traveled through the atmosphere, reached the siren's radio receiver, and sent a signal that accidentally matched the activation code that the system was waiting to hear. Now, the siren did exactly what it had been programmed to do. It just received the command from a place nobody expected could reach it. And that's coming up next on TiPS Today in Public Safety.
Welcome to TiPS Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Here's your host, Fletch, with today's tips.
Welcome to TiPS. This is Fletch, and I'm a NENA certified ENP. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I host the TiPS Today in Public Safety podcast. So sit back and let's figure out what was behind this little event. So back on July 1st, the residents of Huntington County, Indiana, got awakened in the middle of the night by an outdoor emergency warning siren. Emergency management officials eventually determined that the activation was apparently caused by a weather-related radio phenomenon known as, get this, tropospheric ducting. Okay, Mr. Wizard, what the hell's that? So what happened was actually pretty simple. A distant radio signal contained the exact sequence matching the activation code that was accepted by the Indiana siren. The signal hit the receiver and wham! Suddenly the weather had effectively hacked the warning system. Not through malware, not through ransomware, not by compromising a password. No, the atmosphere simply carried a valid-looking command much further than anyone ever expected it to. And that presents a fascinating question for geeks like me in public safety. What happens when the communications infrastructure works exactly as designed, but the environment changes the boundaries of that design? The weather didn't break the radio. Now, in this case, the weather didn't break or stop the radio signal. It didn't weaken it. It didn't block communications between dispatch and the siren. Instead, the atmosphere helped the signal travel way too far. Tropospheric ducting occurs when certain combinations of temperature, humidity, air pressure, and atmospheric layering cause radio waves to become trapped within a layer of the lower atmosphere called the ionosphere. Think of it like an invisible tunnel in the sky. And when radio waves get in there, they can start bouncing around and travel great distances. Under normal conditions, a VHF or UHF radio only travels relatively predictable distances. In fact, any frequency does. Radio engineers model the terrain, they examine antenna height, calculate the transmitter power, then they account for buildings, trees, hills, and other obstacles. Except if you're looking at cellular service at my house, because apparently I live in a black hole. But from this, they create a coverage map showing where the signal should normally be received. But that coverage map is far from being authoritative, and it's not a wall. Under the right atmospheric conditions, a signal can become trapped between layers of air and travel for hundreds of miles before they escape and then hit the ground. So a signal intended for a local system can suddenly appear in a whole other community or even another state. Now, the phenomenon of tropospheric ducting has been long familiar to amateur radio operators and television viewers. If you've got a TV antenna and you turn on the television late at night, you might unexpectedly get a station from a distant locality. A radio hobbyist can suddenly speak with someone hundreds of miles away, even with modest equipment. Many people find it interesting, and sometimes people consider it fun. Amateur radio operators actually call it DXing and have contests for how far they can get. But the problem is when the signal carries a control command for public safety equipment, it becomes an operational issue. The coverage map is not a wall. Radio engineers spend enormous amounts of time designing coverage. Will the signal reach the portable radio inside the school? Will the responder maintain communications in the basement? Will Fletcher get cell service at the house? And will the outdoor warning siren receive its activation command? Coverage engineering typically focuses on making sure the intended signal reaches the intended destination. But this particular incident reminds us that the radio system design must also consider another question. Where else could that signal go? Now, frequency reuse is based on geography, and there are organizations that clear frequencies to ensure agencies don't interfere with each other. But obviously that same radio frequency can be used in distant areas because the normal signal footprints would never overlap. Communities may be separated by hundreds of miles, and under normal conditions, they might as well be on different planets. But atmospheric propagation can temporarily erase some of that geographic separation, and suddenly those distant systems are no longer so distant. They're sharing the same temporary neighborhood, and that doesn't mean that either system was improperly engineered. It just means the environment temporarily changed the assumptions underneath the engineering. When a distant signal becomes a local command. Look, receiving a distant radio signal is one thing, but activating a siren is something entirely different. According to Huntington County's emergency management director, the signal that was received from Iowa accidentally matched the siren's activation code. And that distinction is pretty critical, because it wasn't just simple radio interference. Interference might produce static, garble a transmission, or reduce the audio quality. In this case, the receiver apparently heard something it interpreted as a legitimate instruction. The siren had no idea the signal came from Iowa. It had no idea that atmospheric conditions carried it hundreds of miles from its origin. It only knew that it heard the right code on the right frequency, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. So the siren wasn't broken, it actually functioned exactly as designed. The problem was that the design apparently didn't have enough information to distinguish between a valid local activation command and a coincidentally identical command arriving from 300 miles away. Why would it? Public safety signals need validation. This is why systems need stronger signaling controls. In this situation, it could include more distinctive activation sequences, unique identifiers, multi-step commands, acknowledgement requirements, source validation, time-limited command windows, encrypted or authenticated signaling, or a confirmation process that requires more than one electronic condition before siren activates. The appropriate solution is going to depend on the equipment, the radio, the risk, and the operational environment that it all lives in. But the central principle is simple. Receiving the correct code does not automatically prove the correct source sent it. And that principle applies a lot further than outdoor sirens. It applies to remote gates, building alarms, utility controls, public address systems, warning beacons, legacy paging systems, and any other infrastructure that accepts commands over an open radio channel. What ECCs need to know. Outdoor warning sirens are often managed by emergency management agencies, municipalities, fire departments, or public works organizations. But the ECCs frequently where the public turns when something unexpected happens. The moment a siren activates, dispatchers are going to receive calls asking, is there a tornado? Is there an emergency? Should we evacuate? Was that a test? So the ECC needs immediate situational awareness. Dispatchers should know who activated the system and which sirens were commanded. So that means the siren activation shouldn't exist as an isolated technical function somewhere outside the comm center. No, the process needs operational integration. There needs to be logging. There should be timestamps. There should be clear notification procedures. And don't forget about a defined method for canceling or stopping an accidental activation. And don't forget that there needs to be a public information plan readily available before the siren wakes up half the community at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, the message doesn't have to be complicated. Just, we're aware of the siren activation. There is currently no known emergency. The activation's being investigated. Continue monitoring for official information. Simple, clear, and immediate. Because silence from public safety creates a vacuum, and social media will happily fill that void. This is much bigger than just one siren. Yeah, while this incident just involved an outdoor warning siren, the underlying lesson is a much broader one. Quite often, public safety infrastructure contains systems that was designed decades ago, back when radio commands were considered relatively trustworthy because of their limited range and their limited access. Nowadays, anybody with $50 can buy a Chinese transmitter off the internet that'll broadcast on nearly any frequency, including public safety. Now, in this case, geography provided part of the security model. But geography is not authentication. Distance isn't authentication. Signal strength is not authentication. And simply a correct tone or sequence doesn't necessarily establish the identity of the sender. Now, as more and more public safety systems become interconnected, remotely controlled, and software-defined, we're all improving capabilities, but we're also increasing the importance of command validation. Legacy radio operates under a much simpler rule than IP encryption technology. If you can hear the right signal, do the right thing. And most days, you know what? That works. But on July 1st, the atmosphere found the exception. Reality check. Look, let's be clear. Tropospheric ducting is not anything that's brand new. Radio signals have traveled beyond their expected coverage area for as long as they've existed. And this incident doesn't mean that outdoor warning sirens across the country are suddenly unreliable. It also doesn't mean that every radio-controlled system needs to be replaced. But it does mean agencies need to understand how their systems authenticate commands and whether they authenticate them at all. It's easy. Just ask the radio shop. If you don't know it, find out what exact sequence activates those sirens and how unique and complex is that sequence. Could another system use the same code accidentally or on purpose? Does the receiver validate the source? Does anything log what was received and when? And can the transmitter be identified? Would a second factor confirmation help if it was required? And how quickly can dispatch verify the activation and determine a procedure for stopping a siren that activates unexpectedly? These aren't tough theoretical cybersecurity questions. These are basic operational questions. Because the next unexpected command may not come through the internet. It may not come floating by a temporary tunnel in the sky. We'll leave it there before we give away too much. The bottom line. Look, public safety communication systems are built around expected operating conditions, expected coverage, expected signal strength, expected geography, expected users, and expected commands. But emergencies have this really nasty habit of exposing the difference between what we expected and what the system can actually do. In Huntington County, the weather did not knock the warning system offline. No, it did something far more unusual. It helped a distant radio signal reach a local radio receiver. And that receiver recognized the signal as its own. That siren didn't know the command came from 300 miles away. It only knew the code matched, and that kicked off the workflow. And that's the lesson right there. Resilience is not just making sure the intended signal reaches the intended destination. It also means understanding where else that signal might travel and what systems might hear it, and what those systems might accidentally do when it arrives. Because sometimes the biggest communications problem is not the fact that the message failed to get through, but it's the fact that it did get through to the wrong place. That wraps up this episode of TiPS. This is Fletch. We'll catch you next time. Take care. Hey, it's Fletch. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you learned something new. Remember to catch all of my previous episodes of TiPS, Today in Public Safety, published every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on most social media platforms and streaming 24/7 at 911tips.com. My blogs are located at fletch.tv and my professional website is at fletch911.com. Remember to like and subscribe. It really helps out the algorithms. And if you're in public safety, thanks for what you do every single day. We'll catch you next time. Take care.
You've been listening to TiPS, Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Hosted by Fletch and available every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Catch past episodes on 911tips.com. Be sure to like and subscribe, and remember to join us each week for the latest on NG 911. I am Spider Harrison, the official 911 voiceover dude. Catch me on Sirius XM on various channels, including 90s on 9, the 10 spot, and on the Weekend Countdown on Hits 1. Or don't regret it for the rest of your life. Either way, I'm good.